The San Bernardino attack and the massacres in Paris 3 weeks earlier combined to cause a wave of anti-Muslim sentiment. Leading Republican presidential contender Donald Trump called for an immediate end to all Muslim immigration to the states, while many of the nation's governors and Republican presidential candidates voiced their opposition to the resettlement of Syrian refugees, despite the fact that refugees had played no role in any jihadist attack in the States since 9/11. A pioneer of this particular strain of anti-Muslim paranoia was Pamela Geller, long the most visible and vocal of a number of activists claiming that the United States was threatened by creeping Islamization. Geller, who grew up in Long Island, was working in the genteel offices of the New York Observer as an associate publisher on 9/11. The attack sent her on a personal jihad against what she believed to be a fifth column of Islamo-fascists intent on imposing Sharia law on the American population, among whom she counted President Obama a fellow traveler. She began an organization called Stop Islamization of America and wrote a book titled the same. In 2010, from her blogging perch in her modernist Upper East Side apartment, Geller organized the protests against the establishment of the so-called Ground Zero Mosque in Manhattan. The planned building was in fact 2 blocks from the Trade Center site and wasn't a mosque, but an Islamic community center. The protest turned Geller into a national figure with the imprimatur of a 60 Minutes profile. 3 years later, she was denied entry to the United Kingdom after her books and speeches were classified by British authorities as criminal incitements to racial hatred. It was Geller who organized the ill-fated Garland, Texas cartoon contest in May 2015. In the wake of the shooting, Geller justified her decision to hold the contest by explaining that Muslims had become a special class that Americans were not allowed to offend. This fit well in the long tradition of what Richard Hofstadter termed in 1964 the paranoid style in American politics, his well-known analysis of the vocal conspiracy theorist element of the American far right. More than half a century later, Hofstadter's observations about how the paranoid right interpreted the world still rang true. The central image is that of a vast and sinister conspiracy, a gigantic and yet subtle machinery of influence set in motion to undermine and destroy a way of life. The paranoid spokesman sees the fate of this conspiracy in apocalyptic terms. He traffics in the birth and death of whole worlds, whole political orders, whole systems of human values. He is always manning the barricades of civilization. He constantly lives at a turning point. It is now or never in organizing resistance to the conspiracy. Time is forever running out. Geller updated the paranoid right for the post-9/11 era. Instead of a communist plot to take over America, the 1950s conspiracy du jour, the threat was now Muslims. Geller was only the most visible of a number of such commentators. Former Reagan administration official Frank Gaffney published a pamphlet titled The Muslim Brotherhood in the Obama Administration. Former federal prosecutor Andrew McCarthy offered How Obama Embraces Islam's Sharia Agenda. Frequent Geller collaborator Robert Spencer wrote the book Stealth Jihad, How Radical Islam is Subverting America Without Guns or Bombs. And journalist Paul Sperry added Infiltration, How Muslim Spies and Subversives Have Penetrated Washington. These assertions defied common sense. To claim that nationwide Sharia law is imminent is to ignore simple facts. Muslims make up around 2% of the US population. There isn't a jurisdiction in the states where Sharia is the law, nor is anyone demanding its imposition. Short of a mass conversion of hundreds of millions of citizens to Islam, the chances of one nation under Sharia seem slight. Yet the arguments of the scaremongers have seeped into mainstream political life. The former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, asserted in July 2010 that Sharia is a mortal threat to the survival of freedom and the United States as we know it. The same year, Former CIA Director James Woolsey co-authored a report for the Center for Security Policy that made similar claims. By 2014, 32 state legislatures had introduced bills to outlaw Sharia. 7 of those bills were passed. In other words, 7 states outlawed a practice that didn't exist. Americans have also long tended to overestimate the threats posed by jihadists while underestimating the sources of other forms of terrorism, generally defined as any act of violence against civilians motivated by ideology. Since 9/11, extremists affiliated with a variety of far right-wing credos, including white supremacists, anti-abortion extremists, and anti-government militants, have killed around the same number of people in the United States as have extremists motivated by al-Qaeda's ideology. As we have seen, by the end of 2015, 45 people had been killed in jihadist terrorist attacks in the United States, while right-wing racists and anti-government militants had killed 48. On June 17, 2015, Dylan Roof, a slight white man in his early 20s with a mop of blondish hair, walked into the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, one of the oldest and most storied black churches in the South. After sitting in on a Bible study session for an hour, Roof started shooting the parishioners, saying, "You've raped our women and you are taking over the country." Roof killed 9 African Americans, including Pastor Clementa Pinckney, 41, who was also serving as a South Carolina state senator. Roof later told investigators that he wanted to start a race war. Unaffiliated with any organization, he was a classic example of what white racist Louis Beam termed leaderless resistance. By any reasonable standard, the attack on the church in Charleston was terrorism. Trying to start a race war is a fundamentally political objective, realistic or not. Do the thought experiment. If this attack had been conducted by a Muslim man shouting, "Allahu Akbar," what was a big news story would have become even bigger, as it would have appeared to fit so well into the political and media narrative that almost a decade and a half after 9/11, Muslim militants are the major terrorist problem in the United States. Despite a national history of violence motivated by ideologies other than bin Ladenism, it is jihadist violence that has continued to dominate the news and the attention of policymakers. Some of this is quite understandable. After all, 9/11 remains far and away the most destructive terrorist attack on American soil. And, as we have seen, al-Qaeda and its affiliates have continued to plot attacks in the States that, had they succeeded, could have killed scores or even hundreds. Yet a disparity in media coverage persists between even failed jihadist attacks and successful killings by other militants. Americans often suffer from historical amnesia. A 2015 Washington Post-ABC News poll found that more than 3/4 of Americans were worried about possible jihadist attacks. But the golden age of terrorism in the States was in the 1970s, not in post-9/11 America. During the 70s, the leftist weather underground targeted the Pentagon, the US Capitol, and banks, and was responsible for some 45 bombings. Other anti-war activists carried out major bombings at Fresno State College, the University of Wisconsin, and City Hall in Portland. The Black Panthers, who were active for only 3 years during the 1970s, mounted 24 bombings, assaults, and hijackings. Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional Puertorriqueña, a Puerto Rican separatist group, mounted 82 bombings, mostly in New York and Chicago. There were an astonishing 112 hijackings in the States during the 1970s, and terrorists killed 184 people and injured more than 600 others. In the decade and a half since 9/11, jihadists and far-right terrorists have, by contrast, killed 93. Americans' persistent fear of terrorism can be explained partly by the disparity between expert and lay evaluations of risk. In the words of Clinton Jenkins, a psychologist writing in the peer-reviewed journal Homeland Security Affairs, experts view risk as the likelihood of actual harm based on mortality estimates, whereas lay perceptions of risk are based on a number of qualitative and subjective characteristics. The average person's perception of risk, he explains, is influenced by the voluntariness of exposure, how much control we feel we have, how great we judge the potential damage, how unpredictable the situation seems, and so on. Since terrorists can strike anyone, anywhere, in a random and dreadful manner, we tend to fear them more than we fear far more common and predictable causes of death. In any year since 9/11, Americans were 12,000 times more likely to die in a car accident, for instance, than in a domestic terrorist incident. The extent to which our government and the media participate in this endemic paranoia is damaging in that, apart from doing the terrorist's job for them, which is to terrorize, it helps to crowd out the far more serious issues the planet faces. Climate change is far less telegenic than ISIS. More to the point, homicide is the 15th leading cause of death for Americans. The scale of this death toll resembles both a national security problem and a public health issue. Around 70% of American homicides are accomplished with firearms, according to an authoritative study by the United Nations. Some 88,000 Americans died in gun violence between 2003 and 2010. That means that in the years after 9/11, an American residing in the United States was around 5,000 times more likely to be killed by a fellow citizen armed with a gun than by a terrorist inspired by the ideology of Osama bin Laden. It's probably more or less inevitable that most Americans will die of cancer or a heart attack. But why is it even plausible that Americans in high schools, colleges, movie theaters, and churches should die at the hands of young armed men? Americans generally regard themselves as belonging to an exceptional nation, and in terms of living in a religiously tolerant and enormously diverse country, Americans can certainly take some justified pride. But this exceptionalism can also lead to myopia. Americans kill each other with guns at rates unheard of in other advanced industrialized countries. Britain, with around a fifth of the population of the United States, had 41 gun murders in 2010, while the States had around 11,000. In other words, Americans are 50 times more likely to be murdered with a gun than are British citizens.